Today I'm making 3 flavors of mousse cakes for Valentine's Day using some cute heart-shaped silicone molds, though you could use any shape mold that's about 3 inches in diameter. Mousse cakes are one of my absolute favorite desserts. They taste so light and creamy, and I can't even believe how brightly colored they turned out without having to use a single drop of food coloring. It's a pretty easy recipe that's perfect for making ahead. The full recipe is on my website. Let's get started. I'll start by making the butter biscuit. It has a nice neutral and buttery taste, which makes it the perfect base to use for all 3 mousse flavors. Add 93 grams of unsalted room temperature butter to the bowl of a stand mixer, along with 65 grams each of brown and granulated sugar. Add the paddle attachment and beat on medium-high speed until light and fluffy, about 3 minutes. Give the bowl a quick scrape, then add a large room temperature egg and beat until it's completely combined. Whisk together 165 grams of all-purpose flour with a half teaspoon each of baking soda and salt, then add it 1 tablespoon or so at a time with the mixer running at the slowest speed. I like using an adjustable rolling pin like this to roll cookie dough out because it makes it super easy to get an even and accurate thickness. I'll link to the one I use in the description box below. Grab about half of the dough and sandwich it between 2 sheets of parchment paper and roll it out to about 1/4 inch thick. Using parchment paper instead of flouring your countertop means you'll be able to roll out the scraps many times because you're not adding extra flour to the dough, which will eventually make it too tough. Find a cookie cutter that's a bit smaller than the size of the molds you're using, then stamp out as many shapes as you can. If the dough starts to get too soft, transfer it to a baking sheet and pop it in the freezer for 10 to 20 minutes. This is another good reason to roll out on a sheet of parchment paper. Transfer your cutout cookies to a baking sheet lined with parchment, a silicone baking mat, or my favorite thing to use, a perforated baking mat. All the little holes allow air to circulate, making the cookies bake evenly and preventing them from spreading out too much. I'll link to the one I use in the description. Make sure to leave about 1 inch between each cookie. When you're ready to bake, preheat the oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit or 175 degrees Celsius and bake until slightly puffed and golden brown, about 8 minutes. You may want to turn the pan halfway through to ensure they bake evenly. Let them cool on the pan for about 5 minutes, then transfer them to a wire rack to cool completely. Let's make our blueberry mousse cakes. We'll start by adding 1½ teaspoons of powdered gelatin to a bowl with 2 tablespoons of water. Whisk them together and leave it to bloom or absorb the water for 5 to 10 minutes. Next, add 365 grams of fresh or frozen blueberries to a medium saucepan, along with 40 grams of granulated sugar and 2½ teaspoons of lemon juice. Cook over medium heat while stirring from time to time until the blueberries have softened and let go of all of their juices and it's all starting to look a little bit jammy. Carefully transfer to a blender or food processor, but make sure yours can handle hot liquids, and blend until it's very smooth. Pass it through a sieve into a heat-proof bowl and measure out ½ a cup of the puree. Put the rest in a container and chill it in the fridge. We'll use that later to make the mousse. But first, we're going to make some gelée, which is basically a thick jello made from scratch, to go in the center of our blueberry cakes. Take the bloomed gelatin and microwave it for 10 to 15 seconds just until it melts, and whisk it into the ½ cup of blueberry puree. Pour that all out onto a small baking sheet lined with a silicone or Teflon mat and tilt it around until it's spread evenly and about 1/4 inch thick. Put it in the fridge or freezer until it's completely set. Once it's set, remove it from the mat and using a cookie cutter that's at least 1 inch smaller than the mold you're using, cut out as many shapes as you can and set them aside. If your kitchen is warm, you may want to store these in the fridge until you're ready to assemble the cakes, or the gelée shapes may start to soften. To make the blueberry mousse, start by blooming another 1½ teaspoons of powdered gelatin in 2 tablespoons of water, then heat it in the microwave just until melted, about 10 to 15 seconds. Whisk that into the rest of the blueberry puree we made earlier. Whip 1 cup of heavy whipping cream to stiff peaks. Pour in the blueberry and gelatin mixture and fold in gently until combined. To put it all together, first we're going to fill the molds about halfway full with the blueberry mousse. I like to smooth the mousse up towards the top and sides to make sure I don't have any empty spots left in the mold. If any of the molds are still looking a bit empty, just scoop in a little more mousse. Add a piece of gelée to the center of each mold. Mine turned out a little thinner than I wanted, so I'm just stacking 3 on top of each other. Then you'll top each one with a biscuit base. This is when I realized mine spread a bit too much to fit. Even with a perforated baking mat, some spreading will occur, so I'm just shaving a bit off around the edges. Anyway, top each one with a biscuit base. Ideally, the bases will come right up to the tops of the molds. If they don't, just top them with a bit more mousse and smooth them out, and make a mental note to put more mousse in the mold next time. Freeze for at least 8 hours, or ideally overnight. The raspberry mousse cakes are made in exactly the same way as the blueberry cakes. Just to recap, you'll cook fresh or frozen raspberries along with granulated sugar and lemon juice until they're very soft, have lost their juices, and have turned a little bit jammy. Then you'll blend it, strain it, measure out ½ cup of the puree, and put the rest in a container and chill it in the fridge. Add some bloomed and melted gelatin to the ½ cup of puree, whisk, and pour out onto a small baking sheet and put it in the fridge or freezer to set. Stamp out as many shapes as you can and set aside. To the rest of the raspberry puree, whisk in some more bloomed and melted gelatin and set it aside while you whip the cream to stiff peaks. Fold the puree into the whipped cream. Assemble the raspberry mousse cakes in exactly the same way. Fill the molds about halfway full, smooth out the sides, add a piece of gelée to the center or stack a few on top of each other if they turned out thin like mine. Top with a biscuit, add more mousse if needed, and smooth out the tops. Freeze for at least 8 hours or ideally overnight. The matcha mousse cakes are made a little differently. First, we're going to make some white chocolate ganache for the centers of the cakes, starting by chopping up 100 grams of white chocolate and placing it in a heat-proof and microwave-safe bowl. Heat 100 grams of heavy cream in the microwave or on the stove just until it's steaming and pour it over the chocolate. Let it sit for a minute or 2 and whisk it until smooth. If any of the chocolate pieces refuse to melt, just microwave it for 15 to 30 seconds and whisk it again. Cover it with plastic wrap and refrigerate until cool and thickened, about 2 hours. To make the matcha mousse, we'll start by adding the zest of a lemon into a microwave-safe bowl with 160 grams of whole milk. Microwave that for about 30 seconds or just until steaming. I like my matcha mousse without any added sugar. I think the ganache adds plenty of sweetness. But if you want yours sweeter, you can add up to 40 grams of granulated sugar to the milk before heating it. Let it sit for 10 minutes while you bloom 1½ teaspoons of gelatin in 2 tablespoons of water. Pour the milk through a strainer to remove the zest, then add 4 grams of matcha through a sieve and whisk until smooth. Heat the gelatin in the microwave for 10 to 15 seconds or just until melted and whisk that into the matcha mixture. Leave to cool to room temperature. Whip 1 cup of heavy whipping cream to stiff peaks and fold the matcha mixture in until combined. This mousse starts out more liquid than the berry mousses, but it will set up just fine. To assemble, transfer the white chocolate ganache to a disposable piping bag and snip off about a 1/4 inch from the tip. Fill the molds with the matcha mousse until about halfway full. Pipe in some white chocolate ganache roughly in the shape of a heart or the shape of your mold and top with a biscuit. Top with more mousse if needed and smooth out the tops. Freeze for at least 8 hours or overnight. At least a few hours before you're ready to serve your mousse cakes, carefully peel back the silicone mold and place them on a small cake board or plate. Leave them in the fridge to defrost, and before serving, let them sit out for 20 minutes or so. The taste and texture will be so much better at room temperature. So let's see how they turned out. I love the colors and layers of the raspberry mousse cake, and it tastes so light and fruity. It looks like the white chocolate ganache in the matcha cake sank towards the bottom of the mold. Next time I would pipe the ganache separately and let it freeze solid before adding it to the cake. But it tastes amazing anyway. The blueberry cake is light with lots of blueberry flavor. All in all, I love how these turned out. There you have it, 3 flavors of mousse cakes that are perfect to make ahead of time and serve to your favorite person on Valentine's Day. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to my channel. Thanks for watching!